Sometimes helping family means destroying yourself. I learned this the hard way when my brother Carlos showed up after losing his job and apartment, expecting me to fix his life like I always had. At 55, I'd finally built some peace after my messy divorce, got my own place, and was enjoying retirement from my municipal job. Then Carlos started sending desperate WhatsApp messages at all hours, showing up drunk, and making scenes in front of my neighbors. My parents even wrote a letter basically disowning him and dumping the problem on me. I had to choose between saving my brother and saving myself. Spoiler alert, you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. So I'm Pablo, 55M, retired municipal employee. I worked for the city planning department for 30 years before taking early retirement last year. Best decision I ever made, honestly. After my divorce 3 years ago, I finally got my life back on track. Found a decent one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I spend my days reading, taking walks, maybe meeting friends for coffee. Simple stuff, but after years of drama with my ex-wife, simple feels amazing. My brother Carlos is 2 years younger, but acts like he's still 20. He's bounced between jobs his whole life. Always has some scheme or excuse. Our parents used to bail him out constantly, but they're getting older and tired of his problems. Carlos has this way of making everything about him, you know? Every conversation becomes about his latest crisis. I thought I was done dealing with family drama. My retirement was supposed to be peaceful. I had my routines, my small circle of friends, my quiet evenings. No more stress, no more people depending on me for everything. I'd paid my dues raising my own kids and dealing with my ex's constant demands. But family has this way of pulling you back in, doesn't it? Carlos knew exactly which buttons to push, exactly how to make me feel guilty for having my life together while his fell apart. I should have seen what was coming, but honestly, I was too comfortable in my new peaceful existence to prepare for the storm that was about to hit. Monday evening rolled around, and I was settling in with a book when Carlos showed up at my door. I could smell the alcohol on him before he even stepped inside. He looked rough, unshaven, clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. That desperate look in his eyes I remembered from our teenage years. He told me he'd lost his job at the warehouse 2 weeks ago. Something about showing up late too many times, but he insisted it wasn't his fault. His supervisor had it out for him, he said. The usual Carlos story where nothing was ever his responsibility. I made us coffee and listened to his rambling explanation. He mentioned that his landlord had given him notice, said he had until Friday to find the rent money or get out. I asked him how much he needed and watched him fidget with his phone, avoiding eye contact. He said he was a little short, maybe just needed a place to crash for a few days while he figured things out. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, the same feeling I'd get whenever Carlos came around with problems. He kept emphasizing it would just be temporary, just until he got back on his feet. I told him I'd think about it, that my place was small and I valued my privacy. He got defensive immediately, asking if I was really going to turn away my own brother. He reminded me how our parents always helped family, how blood was thicker than water, all those guilt trips I'd heard 1,000 times before. After he left, I sat there feeling unsettled. Something about his story didn't add up. 2 weeks unemployed, but he only just got eviction notice? And why come to me instead of our parents first? They'd always been his go-to for bailouts. Around midnight, my phone started buzzing. WhatsApp messages from Carlos, one after another. The first few were just asking if I'd made a decision, but then they got more frantic. He told me he had nowhere else to go, that he'd already asked everyone he could think of. He said he was scared and didn't know what he was going to do. The messages kept coming every few minutes. He wrote that he was sitting in his car because he couldn't face going back to his empty apartment. He said he felt like a failure, like everyone had given up on him. Then he sent a message that really got to me. He wrote that he understood if I didn't want to help, that he probably deserved whatever happened to him. I turned off my phone and tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about those messages. Carlos had always been dramatic, but something felt different this time. More desperate, more real. I'd seen him bounce back from setbacks before, but this felt like rock bottom. By morning, I had 17 more messages waiting for me. The tone had shifted from desperate to angry. He wrote that he couldn't believe his own brother would leave him hanging like this. He said I'd gotten selfish since my divorce, that success had gone to my head. The last message just said that he hoped I could sleep at night, knowing he might end up on the streets. I stared at those messages for a long time, feeling the weight of 30 years of being Carlos's safety net. Part of me wanted to help, but another part was exhausted by the cycle. How many times had I bailed him out only to watch him make the same mistakes again? Tuesday afternoon, I met my friend Miguel at our usual spot, a neighborhood bar where we'd been having beers since I moved to the area. Miguel's about my age, divorced too, and he's got a good head on his shoulders. I needed someone to talk through this Carlos situation without all the emotional baggage. I explained the whole thing, the late-night visit, the sob story about losing his job, those desperate WhatsApp messages that kept coming. Miguel listened without interrupting, nursing his beer and nodding occasionally. When I finished, he asked me what I really thought Carlos wanted. I told him I suspected it wasn't just a few days on my couch. Carlos had this pattern of starting small and then expanding his needs. A few days becomes a few weeks, then a few months. Before you know it, you're supporting a grown man who's decided your problem is his solution. Miguel asked if I felt obligated to help because he was family. That hit close to home because, yeah, I did feel obligated. Our parents had drilled into us that family sticks together, that you don't abandon your own blood. But Miguel pointed out that obligation goes both ways. Carlos had obligations too, like being a responsible adult. I admitted I was scared of looking selfish. What if Carlos really was at rock bottom? What if this time was different and he genuinely wanted to change? Miguel laughed and asked me how many times I'd heard that before. Too many to count, I had to admit. Then Miguel got serious and told me something that stuck with me. He said his own brother had pulled similar stunts for years, and Miguel had enabled it by always swooping in to rescue him. His brother never learned to handle his own problems because Miguel was always there to fix things. It wasn't helping, it was hurting. He told me that if I took Carlos in, I'd lose my life. Not dramatically, just gradually. My peaceful retirement would become managing Carlos's chaos. My quiet apartment would become his crash pad. My savings would become his emergency fund. He said I'd worked too hard for my peace to throw it away on someone who didn't appreciate it. I asked him what he thought I should do, and he suggested talking to our parents first. If Carlos was really in crisis, surely they'd want to help their own son. If they weren't willing to help, that might tell me something important about the situation. Miguel also warned me about Carlos's manipulation tactics. The guilt trips, the emotional blackmail, the way he'd make me feel responsible for his choices. He said Carlos was probably counting on my guilt to override my common sense. Family loyalty was important, but it shouldn't come at the cost of my own well-being. As we finished our beers, Miguel reminded me that saying no to Carlos wasn't abandoning him. It was refusing to enable his irresponsibility. Real help might actually mean forcing Carlos to face his problems instead of running to Big Brother for another bailout. Walking home, I felt clearer about the situation but more conflicted too. Miguel made sense, but those desperate messages kept nagging at me. What if this really was different? What if Carlos had finally hit bottom and was ready to change? But then I remembered all the other times I'd thought the same thing, and how it always ended with Carlos taking advantage of my kindness and disappearing once he got back on his feet. Wednesday morning, I drove over to my parents' house, a small place in the older part of town where they'd lived for 20 years. Mom was tending her garden when I pulled up, and Dad was reading the newspaper on the front porch like he did every morning since retiring. I sat down with them at their kitchen table and explained Carlos's situation. I watched their faces carefully as I described his job loss, the eviction notice, and his request to stay with me. Mom sighed deeply and shook her head, while Dad's expression hardened in a way I recognized from our childhood. Mom told me they'd already heard from Carlos. He'd called them Sunday night, apparently, with the same story he'd given me. She said they'd told him no, that they couldn't help this time. I was surprised. They'd always been Carlos's first line of defense before. Dad explained that they'd been supporting Carlos on and off for the past year. Small amounts here and there. Help with rent a few months back. Even bought him groceries when he claimed he was broke. But they'd discovered he'd been lying about some of it. He'd asked for rent money while secretly spending his paycheck on who knows what. Mom looked tired talking about it. She said they loved Carlos but couldn't keep enabling his behavior. Every time they helped, he'd disappear for months until the next crisis. No phone calls, no visits, just radio silence until he needed something again. I asked them what they thought I should do, and Dad was blunt. He said Carlos was a grown man who needed to face the consequences of his choices. Helping him now would just delay the inevitable next crisis. Dad had clearly reached his limit with Carlos's drama. Then Mom went to their bedroom and came back with an envelope. She handed it to me and told me they'd written Carlos a letter after his phone call Sunday. She said I should read it to understand how serious they were about not helping this time. I opened the envelope and read their letter. It was harsh but clear. They told Carlos they were done supporting him financially and emotionally. They wrote that they'd given him countless chances to get his life together, and he'd wasted every one. The letter said they still loved him but couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore. The part that really got my attention was near the end. They wrote that they wouldn't ask me to help Carlos either, that it wouldn't be fair to burden me with their son's problems. They said if Carlos ended up on the streets, it would be because of his own choices, not because his family abandoned him. Dad told me they'd mailed the letter Monday, so Carlos should have received it by now. That explained why he'd been so desperate in his messages to me. His usual safety net had just disappeared. I was probably his last option, which made his pressure tactics make more sense. Mom asked me not to feel guilty about whatever I decided. She said they'd learned the hard way that helping Carlos usually meant hurting themselves. Their marriage had suffered, their retirement savings had taken hits, and their stress levels had gone through the roof. They couldn't do it anymore. As I drove home, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that my parents supported whatever decision I made, but sadness that it had come to this point with Carlos. The letter felt like a final judgment, a formal severing of the family safety net that had always caught Carlos when he fell. I understood now why Carlos had seemed so desperate. He'd burned through his usual sources of help and was facing real consequences for the first time. Part of me felt sorry for him, but another part wondered if this might finally be the wake-up call he needed. Thursday evening, I was coming home from the grocery store when I saw Carlos waiting by my building entrance. He looked worse than Monday, unshaven, clothes dirty, and that wild look people get when they're running on no sleep and too much stress. Several of my neighbors were around, coming home from work, and I really didn't want a scene. Carlos saw me and immediately started talking loudly about how I'd been ignoring his calls. I told him quietly that we should go upstairs to talk, but he wasn't having it. He said he'd been waiting for 2 hours and wasn't going anywhere until we settled this. Mrs. Rodriguez from 3B was getting her mail and obviously listening to every word. Carlos noticed her too and started speaking even louder, like he wanted an audience. He told me he couldn't believe his own brother was going to let him sleep on the streets. He said our parents had already abandoned him, and now I was doing the same. I tried to get him to lower his voice, but he was on a roll. He started listing all the times he'd helped me over the years, which was mostly exaggerated nonsense. He claimed he'd been there for me during my divorce, which was laughable since he'd disappeared for 6 months during that whole mess. Mr. Chun from the first floor came out to see what the commotion was about. Carlos immediately turned to him and asked if he thought it was right for someone to abandon their own brother. Mr. Chin looked uncomfortable and mumbled something about family being important before hurrying away. That's when Carlos really lost it. He started yelling about how I'd gotten selfish since my retirement, how I was sitting pretty in my apartment while he suffered. He said I'd forgotten where I came from, and that success had made me cold. The whole street could hear him at this point. I felt my face burning with embarrassment. These were my neighbors, people I saw every day, and here was Carlos making me look like some heartless monster. I could see curtains moving in windows as people watched the show. Mrs. Garcia from across the street was standing on her balcony, not even pretending she wasn't listening. Carlos must have sensed he was getting to me because he doubled down. He started crying, right there on the sidewalk, talking about how alone he felt and how his own family had given up on him. He said he'd always looked up to me and couldn't understand how I'd become so cruel. A few more neighbors had gathered, probably thinking there might be trouble. Carlos noticed them too and started appealing to them directly. He asked if they thought it was right for a successful man to let his brother become homeless. Some people nodded sympathetically, and I could see they were buying his performance. I realized this was exactly what Carlos wanted, public pressure to force my hand. He was betting that I'd be too embarrassed to say no in front of all these people. The manipulation was so obvious once I saw it clearly, but it was working. I felt the weight of all those judging eyes. Finally, I told Carlos we'd talk upstairs. He wiped his tears and followed me up, probably thinking he'd won. But walking up those stairs, I felt something shift inside me. The public humiliation had backfired on Carlos. Instead of making me want to help him, it showed me exactly how far he'd go to manipulate me. In my apartment, Carlos immediately started apologizing for the scene outside. He said he was just desperate and didn't know what else to do. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, The way he was watching my reaction to see if his street theater had worked. That's when I knew for sure that this wasn't about genuine need. It was about control. Friday night, Carlos showed up at my door again, but this time he looked different. Cleaner, calmer, like he'd pulled himself together. He asked if he could come in and talk, said he owed me an apology for the scene yesterday. Against my better judgment, I let him in. He sat on my couch and immediately started talking about how he'd spent the day thinking about his life. He said he'd been unfair to me, that I didn't deserve his anger when I'd always been supportive. He looked genuinely remorseful, which threw me off because Carlos rarely apologized for anything. Then he told me he'd been thinking about our conversation Monday night, about how I'd said I valued my privacy and quiet life. He said he understood that now, that he'd been selfish to assume I'd just drop everything to help him. He said he respected the life I'd built and didn't want to disrupt it. I found myself listening more openly than I had all week. This was the Carlos I remembered from when we were kids, thoughtful, self-aware, capable of real reflection. He told me he'd realized that his problems weren't my responsibility, that he'd been unfair to put that pressure on me. But then he made his real pitch. He said he just needed a place to stay for 1 week, maybe 2 at most, while he figured out his next move. He promised he'd be quiet, clean, and respectful. He said he'd already lined up some job interviews and just needed a stable address to work from. He told me he'd learned his lesson about taking family for granted. He said losing his apartment and job had been a wake-up call, that he was finally ready to get his life together. He looked me in the eye and promised this time would be different, that he wouldn't take advantage of my kindness. Then Carlos started crying again, but these tears seemed real. He said he was scared and ashamed, that he'd wasted so many opportunities and hurt the people who cared about him. He said he understood if I couldn't trust him after all the times he'd let me down, but he was begging for one last chance. I felt myself wavering. This vulnerable Carlos was hard to resist, especially when he was acknowledging his past mistakes and making specific promises about changing. Maybe Miguel and my parents were wrong. Maybe this really was Carlos's rock-bottom moment, the crisis that would finally motivate him to turn his life around. He told me he'd already talked to a counselor about his drinking and was planning to attend some support meetings. He said he'd been using alcohol to avoid dealing with his problems, but he was ready to face them sober. He even showed me a pamphlet from a local AA group. For a moment, I almost said yes. Carlos seemed so sincere, so different from the manipulative person who'd made a scene in front of my neighbors. This felt like the breakthrough conversation I'd been hoping for, where he finally took responsibility and asked for help in a mature way. But something held me back. Maybe it was Miguel's warning about losing my life, or the memory of my parents' letter, or just instinct. I told Carlos I needed to think about it overnight, that it was a big decision and I wanted to be sure. His face fell immediately, and I saw a flash of something: anger? Calculation? Before he composed himself again, he said he understood, that he was asking a lot, but reminded me that time was running out. He said he'd have to make other arrangements soon if I couldn't help. After he left, I sat there replaying the conversation. Part of me felt hopeful that Carlos was finally ready to change, but another part wondered if I'd just witnessed his most sophisticated manipulation yet. The timing felt convenient. Showing up calm and apologetic right after his public tantrum failed to work. I realized I was looking for reasons to say yes, because saying no felt so harsh. But maybe harsh was what Carlos needed. Maybe my parents were right that helping him now would just delay his real reckoning with his choices. Saturday morning, I was walking through the town square, trying to clear my head and make a final decision about Carlos, when I saw him sitting on a bench near the fountain. He looked up when he saw me coming and gave me this hopeful smile that made me feel terrible. He asked if I'd made up my mind, and I could hear the desperation under his casual tone. I sat down next to him and told him I'd decided I couldn't let him stay with me. I explained that I needed to protect my own peace and stability, that I'd worked too hard to rebuild my life after my divorce. Carlos's expression changed immediately. The hopeful mask dropped, and I saw real anger underneath. He told me I was being selfish and cruel, that family was supposed to stick together no matter what. He said he'd never imagined his own brother could be so heartless. Then he switched tactics and started talking about sleeping on park benches and under bridges. He said he guessed that's what his life had come to, that his own family would rather see him homeless than inconvenienced. He was speaking loudly enough that other people in the square were starting to notice. I felt that familiar pressure, the weight of public judgment and family guilt. But then I remembered something and pulled out my phone. I showed Carlos the WhatsApp messages he'd been sending me all week, the angry ones, the manipulative ones, the ones where he'd called me selfish and threatened to make me regret not helping him. His face went pale when he saw I'd kept all the messages. I told him these didn't look like messages from someone who was genuinely grateful for help or ready to change. They looked like messages from someone who felt entitled to my support and angry when he didn't get it. Then I pulled out the letter my parents had written him. I told him I knew they'd already cut him off, that he'd lied about them being his first stop for help. I said I knew he'd been taking money from them under false pretenses, which is why they'd finally had enough. Carlos tried to grab the letter, but I held it back. I read him the part where our parents said they wouldn't ask me to sacrifice my well-being for his problems. I told him they'd warned me about exactly this conversation, about how he'd try to make me feel guilty and responsible for his choices. He got defensive and started denying things, but I could see he knew he'd been caught. The sincere, reformed Carlos from last night disappeared completely, replaced by the angry, entitled version I knew better. He told me I'd regret this decision. That family meant nothing to me anymore. I stood up and told him that family did mean something to me, which is why I wasn't going to enable his self-destruction anymore. I said real help would be forcing him to face the consequences of his choices instead of always providing an escape route. Carlos started making a scene, raising his voice and gesturing dramatically. People were definitely staring now, but I didn't care anymore. I'd learned something important from Thursday's sidewalk performance. His public manipulation only worked if I was afraid of looking bad. I told him loudly and clearly that I'd offered to help him find resources, job placement services, and counseling programs, but he'd only wanted free housing and financial support. I said I was done being his emergency fund and crash pad, that he needed to take responsibility for his own life. Then I walked away, leaving him sitting there on the bench. I could hear him calling after me, but I didn't turn around. For the first time all week, I felt clear about my decision. The messages and the letter had shown me the truth. Carlos wasn't looking for help. He was looking for another enabler. Epilogue. That was 6 months ago, and I haven't heard from Carlos since that morning in the town square. I don't know where he ended up or how he's doing, and I've made peace with not knowing. My parents occasionally mention that he hasn't contacted them either, which tells me he's probably found someone else to take advantage of. I still think about that week sometimes, especially when I'm enjoying my quiet evenings or peaceful weekends. I wonder if I made the right choice, but then I remember those manipulative messages, and I know I did. Miguel was right. If I'd taken Carlos in, I would have lost my life to his chaos. My neighbors still nod politely when they see me, so apparently Carlos's sidewalk performance didn't permanently damage my reputation. Mrs. Rodriguez actually told me a few weeks later that she thought I'd handled a difficult situation well. Turns out people aren't as easily fooled by manipulation as manipulators think they are. I learned something important about family loyalty that week. Real love sometimes means saying no, especially when saying yes would hurt both people involved. Carlos needed to face his problems, not run from them to his big brother's couch. I couldn't save him from himself, and trying would have just delayed his reckoning while destroying my peace. My retirement is still quiet and simple, exactly how I wanted it. I still meet Miguel for beers, still read my books, still enjoy my small routines. Sometimes the best way to help someone is to refuse to help them, even when it feels cruel. Especially when it feels cruel.